Thank you. Oh, I can put it back. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Do you want Jim on the mic to do the intro? Okay. We actually
Microphones. Wow.
We upgraded.
Yeah.
I'm impressed.
Did it reattach? I had to cycle off.
We're going, so.
We good?
Yeah, let's do it.
Caitlin, are we doing one next month? I don't believe so.
No behind the baton for the ballet. We are not. Okay.
Okay, this is it then.
This is it.
All right.
Yeah.
Good evening. Welcome to Behind the Baton. My name's Jim Davidson. I'm the assistant director of the symphony and the organist here at First and Calvary. Is the audio better this month, hopefully? Fantastic. Great. Before we get started tonight, I just wanted to invite you to a couple events here at the church. If you noticed, we were very ambitious with how many people we were expecting tonight. That is because we're already preset for a concert Sunday afternoon. We're hosting the Springfield Chamber Chorus here at the church. It's a free concert, so I would love for you guys to come back for that. And then, as you know, we're approaching Easter, and here at the church, we're a very musical church. We actually employ a composer in residence, Faith Zimmer, who is from Springfield here, and we're premiering 2 new works over the next few weeks of hers, one on Palm Sunday and then one on Easter Sunday. So if you're looking for a place to hang out on Easter, we would love to have you here. Those will be in the 11 o'clock sanctuary service, one of them with the chancel choir and the bell choir, and then on Easter Sunday with a brass quintet and the chancel choir and the organ and all the bells and whistles and stops for Easter. If you have any questions, feel free to grab me to the side. We love hosting you guys. We love hosting the symphony. We really have appreciated doing this year, and hopefully we can do that maybe in seasons to come. I bet we can work something out. So without any further ado, please welcome Kyle for Behind the Baton.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you very much. And I want let's all just thank First and Calvary for hosting us this year. This has been a really nice place for us to do our talks. Can you all hear me okay? So yeah, sounds good. We actually finally welcome to the people who are listening online as well. We have upgraded our technology now, and so for those listening online, we should be mic'd in a little bit better, just in time for the final Behind the Baton of the season. But that's all right. There will be many more after this season. This is our final classical concert of the year. Although the next concert in May, our collaboration with the St. Louis Ballet is sort of a hybrid between pops and classical. The repertoire this year with the ballet is music of Gershwin and Morton Gould and Richard Rodgers, so it's more in the pops vein, even though it is traditionally symphonic music that we'll be playing on that. But we will not have a Behind the Baton next month for that concert. So that concert, it will be self-explanatory with our wonderful ballet dancers on that program. So welcome to the final classical concert of the season, the final Behind the Baton. It's been a good year here, the 90th anniversary season for the Springfield Symphony. And if you've been attending regularly, and I know most of you do because I see you out there, you know that we've done some big repertoire this year. Shostakovich and Tchaikovsky and Rodgers and Hammerstein's Carousel, Mahler's Second Symphony, Gershwin, Porgy and Bess, Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. It's been a loud season, a lot of loud, bombastic music. This concert is a little bit of a contrast to those other programs, a little bit of a respite. This is a program of music that is mostly Baroque and classical. One 20th century piece, but it's a piece that is inspired by the classical period in music. It's a slightly smaller orchestra. Actually, it's a much smaller orchestra than we had for Mahler, but it's a slightly smaller orchestra than we had for Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. We are playing 4 pieces on the program. We don't have a guest soloist per se, although we are featuring 3 of our own players in the earliest piece on the program, and that is Johannes Bach's Brandenburg Concerto No. 4. And that is for 2 flutes and violin and orchestra. So our concertmaster David Hayes will be the violin soloist featured, and our principal and second flute, Jill and Betsy, will be our featured wind players on that. But we don't have an out-of-town guest artist, so tonight it's just me here with you. And what I think I'm going to do tonight, I'll tell you what the pieces that we're going to play are, but I'm not going to tell you a lot about those individual pieces because I will be doing a pre-concert talk before the concert. But I thought tonight I would talk a little bit about the term symphony as a form and how it evolved, because you can really track its evolution through the 4 pieces that we're playing on this concert. So I'll talk about the pieces more in the context of that evolution of the symphony as a form or a genre. And then if you want to hear more about the individual composers and pieces, you can come to the pre-concert talk on Saturday. Has our deluge begun? Yeah. So now the rain starts to fall. So I sometimes have people ask the question related to the name of our orchestra, the Springfield Symphony Orchestra. They say, Springfield Symphony Orchestra says symphony and orchestra in your title. What is the difference between a symphony and an orchestra and a philharmonic? And the answer is pretty simple. No difference whatsoever. No difference at all. And someone once asked me, he said, well, is a symphony or a philharmonic more prestigious than a symphony orchestra? Because the New York Philharmonic, the Los Angeles Philharmonic are the prestige orchestras in those cities. And I say, yes, but in Boston, it's the Boston Symphony that is the more prestigious. The Atlanta Symphony. So I guess it really depends on the city which one is more prestigious. It actually really depends on which orchestra was founded first and what they chose as that name. But a philharmonic and a symphony and an orchestra are all the same thing. They all describe an ensemble. And the most general term is symphony, right? We are a symphony orchestra. Even the New York Philharmonic is a symphony orchestra. And so there is sometimes confusion about when I talk about the symphony, are we talking about the orchestra or are we talking about a musical piece? And the answer is, again, it depends on the context, but the symphony as an organization, as an ensemble, is named after what we play most, which is the form of the symphony. So if you go back 300 years, orchestras weren't called symphonies because we didn't really have symphonies quite yet. We were pretty close to having symphonies, but it wasn't the general term for what we played. So the term symphony itself was, before it became known as these 4 movement works that we play by Beethoven and Brahms and Tchaikovsky, symphony was a very general term for a musical piece. And it really meant instruments coming together to play as a group. I mean, that's the very general sense of what a symphony was. It meant concord, or music played together that sounds nice. As opposed to, I want to make sure I get the term exactly correct, as opposed to diaphonia, which was a term that meant dissonance. So symphony meant concord and diaphonia meant dissonance. And so the symphony was a group of instruments that played together. That's the end of the definition. It didn't say how many instruments. It didn't say what kind of instruments. It didn't say what the piece was. It was just a group of instruments playing together in concord. And if we go back to the early days of what we would consider now classical music or Western music, that really kind of originated in 2 forms. It came out of the church. That was the most significant area of development of Western music. And then it came out of more of the folk and theatrical traditions. And so music developed organically in the church. It started with voices that were singing liturgical texts, and then they added harmony to those voices. You know, the original was chant. And when we think about chant, you think about one line, Ave, one line, a whole group of people chanting together. Then we add another line to it and another line, and suddenly you have harmony and an ensemble singing. And then you say, well, we're going to add some instruments to that to reinforce those vocal lines, and suddenly you have an ensemble that's accompanying singers. And now we've developed our form, and we start writing masses that are for liturgical celebration, but with an ensemble supporting vocalists. So that's kind of the way that we begin that development. Now, way back in the 17th century, in the early part of the 17th century, at the very end, actually it's the end of the 16th century, at the end of the Renaissance, beginning of the Baroque era, there were a group of people in Florence, Italy, who created a new art form, and that was the art form of opera. It was a group called the Florentine Camerata, a group of philosophers and artists and musicians whose stated goal was to try to recreate the way that Greek dramas were performed. You know, if we had the text of Greek dramas, but we didn't know exactly how they were performed, and they had things called choruses in the Greek dramas. And so these men, and they were all men at that time, in the Florentine Camerata came up with the idea of opera. And opera was sung, it was voices that sang, they were accompanied by instruments, and they had choruses, and they were telling stories. And they were always the stories of gods and kings. That was part of the stipulation about what opera was going to be. And for the operas, they started to write a little instrumental introduction to the operas. What today you would all know if we called an overture, right? That begins the opera. But at that time, they called it a sinfonia. You can see how where I'm heading with this. They called it a sinfonia. The sinfonia was the overture to an early opera at the end of the Renaissance and the early part of the Baroque. Group of instruments, sinfonia, playing together. And so I'm going to give you an example of one. I'm going to play you an example from Monteverdi, one of the early Italian composers. And this is the sinfonia that he opens his opera Orfeo with. So Greek mythology, and this is the instrumental introduction to the opera. Now, one of the things that was significant about these ensembles, as I mentioned early on, is that it didn't really matter all that much what instruments were playing it. It was common to say, whatever instruments you have on hand, that's your orchestra. So if it happened to be things like, stringed instruments that you were hearing there, things that like a hurdy-gurdy that would just provide a drone kind of sound, trombones were frequently used. The early form of the trombone, we might call a sackbut, that then became the trombone. Whatever you had on hand, you put together, and that was your sinfonia, or your symphony that started these operas. And that meant from one performance to another, it wouldn't necessarily be the same. But you wouldn't know that because it's not like you would be traveling around the country looking for performances of Orfeo to experience. We move on through the Baroque era, and things become more and more formalized and more developed, and composers started specifying what instruments were to be played, and they started creating longer and more elaborate forms and various aspects of music. theory developed, so counterpoint and various aspects of harmony developed, and so the music became more and more complex. But still, the title of sinfonia was dominant, and the structure that we think of as a modern symphony had not yet developed. And now I'm going to skip forward to the end of the Baroque period to J.S. Bach, the one of the greatest composers of all time. Known largely as a church composer. Most of his output was written for the church. He was a church musician. But he did write some secular music, or music that was not intended for church services. And one of those sets of pieces were the Brandenburg concertos that we are going to be performing for you this weekend. Now, when you hear the term concerto as it regards the Brandenburg concertos, you might think, oh, we just heard a concerto last month. We heard the Sibelius violin concerto, and before that we've heard things like the Tchaikovsky piano concerto and Rachmaninoff piano concertos. This is not the same kind of concerto. At this time period, concerto might have been used interchangeably with sinfonia. It really just meant another group of instruments. In this particular case, this is what we would have called a concerto grosso, or a large concerto, which meant there were two groups or multiple groups of instruments that played with and against each other. But it was not a concerto in the sense of a piece for a solo instrument that then is accompanied by an orchestra. Quarters and a violin, as it may be, and a group of strings, and then they play with and against each other. And so I'm going to play for you just a few minutes, just a couple minutes of Brandenburg Concerto number 4 that you'll hear this weekend, so you can hear the style. But again, this is a sinfonia, or a group of instruments playing together. And so you'll notice a couple things about that. One is no trombones, no trumpets, no clarinets, no French horns, just stringed instruments, and then the two flutes along with the violin soloist. But Bach did leave one element of this to chance of what you might have at your disposal, because he also includes a part that we call the continuo, which is part of the accompaniment of the concerto. And that was generally a keyboard instrument, usually a harpsichord, as in the case of this particular performance, but it also would involve, it would depend what other bass instrument you had around. So it was sometimes a bassoon would play with the harpsichord, sometimes a single cello, sometimes a bass, a string upright bass. You can kind of think of a continuo as like a jazz trio where you have a piano and a... That's kind of what the continuo does, and the continuo accompanies our solo group of the violin and flutes, and then the whole orchestra plays alternating with that. So, still no symphonies at this time, just sinfonia. But shortly after this, Bach dies, and he has, as most of us know, he has 20 children, and several of them become composers, including two in particular, Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach, CPE Bach, and Wilhelm Friedrich Bach, WF Bach. I mean, there were more, but those were the two that were the most significant. And they were two that became very acquainted with Italian operas and the symphonies, or the sinfonias, that were the overtures for the Italian operas, and they started writing in this Italian style. They kind of left behind their father's German church style and started writing in the Italian style, and they started elaborating on these sinfonias and made them multiple sections. So you'd have a fast section, and then a slow section, and then a fast section. And then those sections actually would divide, and they became the three movements that we think of. Now it's four, but we think of at the beginning of the symphonies. Three movements: fast, slow, and fast. And so I'm going to play an example, not by C.P.E. Bach, not by W.F. Bach, but by Mozart, that we are going to play this weekend. And interestingly, this is a little symphony, but it is called an overture in this case. So we think of Mozart as a great symphony composer. He wrote things like the Jupiter and he wrote the Paris and the Prague symphonies. Those were his late works, but his early works were very much in this just slightly past Baroque style of the Italians and of C.P.E. Bach and W.F. Bach. And this is a piece that Mozart wrote at the ripe old age of 14. Actually, the opera he wrote when he was 14. It's the opera Mitridate, and he actually borrowed from himself something that he had written a little bit younger. Can you imagine a 14-year-old going back to some of their younger works? Anyway, he did in this case, and what we're going to hear is actually a symphony that in this case is titled an overture. So, two things happened in the not very long time between Bach's death and when Mozart, as a child, is writing his operas. One of those is the transition from what we call the Baroque period in music into what we call the classical period of music. And in the classical period of music, things like melody and structure become more important than they were in the Baroque period, where counterpoint, which is the notes playing against notes, are really the dominant feature. The structure becomes more important. And we have developed what we call sonata form. Sonata form, very basically, is just a structure that composers would use, where you take one melody, and then you give a second melody, you mix them around a little bit, and then you come back and you hear melody A and melody B again. And then there are rules about the keys and how long and the proportions and so forth, but that's the basic idea. So this sonata form dominates the symphony, at least the first movement of the symphony. The other thing that happened is we start adding instruments to the orchestra, and they start being very specifically specified. So it's no longer, whatever you have on hand. Now we have a string orchestra, violins, violas, cellos, bass, and we have bassoons almost every time. We have French horns almost every time, and then some sort of upper wind instrument. Sometimes flutes, in the case of this piece, is flutes. Sometimes oboes. They kind of traded off. And in fact, at this time period, most oboe players played flute and vice versa. Rarely clarinets. We don't get clarinets into the symphony until very end of Mozart's life. And very rarely things like trumpets and trombones, again, until the end of Mozart's life, the end of Haydn's life. So that's where the symphony comes out as a form that we think of as the symphony. Then something really, really significant happens, which is in 1803, Beethoven writes his Eroica Symphony, his third symphony, the Heroic Symphony. And we haven't announced this yet, so don't tell anybody, but we are playing it next year with the symphony, the Eroica Symphony. And this is the moment where the symphony as a form is dragged into what we now call the Romantic era in music. That's when the composer starts thinking of the form as a vessel for an expression of their emotions and their soul. So that's Beethoven. You've all heard me talk a little bit about that. We talked about that last month with Beethoven's Fifth. But listen to the beginning of Beethoven's Third Symphony, and you'll hear just immediately that this has become a much bigger form. So, and this will go on now for 45 minutes. It's the biggest symphony that's ever been written at the time. No one, had really gone. Mozart had one symphony that was maybe 36, 37 minutes, but really going 45 minutes was enormous. And so Beethoven really establishes finally and firmly what the symphony was as a genre. So much so that after Beethoven's death, there were serious debates in Germany about whether anybody should bother writing any more symphonies. They said Beethoven did it. Wagner felt like if you kept writing symphonies, you were kind of an old fuddy-duddy, you were too conservative, and nobody was going to do it as well as Beethoven did, so you shouldn't do it. And they went off in a different direction. Brahms, on the other hand, continued along that path of Beethoven. There is a figure between Beethoven and Brahms, and you're going to hear his music this weekend, and that is the figure of Schubert. And Schubert, without giving too much away, because I am going to talk about him on Saturday, Schubert was an early romantic. He was a contemporary of Beethoven, or at least at the end of Beethoven's life. The piece that we're going to play this weekend is his fifth between the composition of Beethoven's 8th and 9th symphonies. So that gives you a little perspective. The Ode to Joy symphony had not been written yet, but the first 8, the big Beethoven 5th, 7th, those had all been composed. Schubert was an interesting guy and died tragically young before he had even turned 30, but he was prolific. He wrote more than 600 songs. The year that he wrote this Fifth Symphony, he was old compared to Mozart. He was 19. So he was old compared to Mozart. The year of his 19th year, the year that he wrote this symphony, he wrote more than 200 works, including a mass and 3 symphonies and a bunch of string quartets and piano pieces, whole bunch of songs. I mean, he was prolific. But he wrote almost as though Beethoven never existed. So to me, Schubert is what would have happened if Mozart had lived another 30 years. Or what would have happened if Beethoven hadn't dragged the world into the Romantic era. He's much more classically oriented, much more oriented towards structure, although probably more personally expressive than the classical symphonists. But this symphony that we're going to play for you this weekend, his Fifth Symphony, is just a charming, joyful work and very much in the style of a Mozart symphony. And I want to play the beginning for you so you can hear what it sounds like. You could be forgiven for mistaking that for a Mozart symphony. And in fact, even when you looked at the orchestra on the stage, you could again be forgiven for thinking it's a Mozart symphony, because after Beethoven has added contrabassoon and piccolo and trombones and trumpets and timpani and cymbals and triangle and all these instruments to the orchestra, we're back in the classical world where we have one flute, we have 2 oboes, we have 2 bassoons and strings. That's it. No clarinets, 2 horns, no trombones, no trumpets, no percussion. Just a classical orchestra playing in a classical style. It is charming, though. It is beautiful, and it is just, it's lighthearted and fun, and there's no big, deep story to it. There's no tragic meaning. It's just enjoyable music. It's music to listen to and enjoy. We have one more piece on the program, and I'm just going to tease it for you. It is by a contemporary composer. Her name is Caroline Shaw. She's one of the youngest composers, maybe the youngest composer to win the Pulitzer Prize. She's on the faculty at the Juilliard School, and we're doing a piece by her for strings alone, and it's called entr'acte, which is another word for overture, which is another word for sinfonia. And so we've come all the way full circle from the Sinfonia leading to our Bach-Brandenburg Concerto, leading to our Mozart Symphony, and we've gone back to another form of with Caroline Shaw's piece. And this piece is a modern piece, but it is based on a string quartet by Haydn, so another classical composer. And so there will be modern techniques. You will hear modern sounds in here, but you'll hear resonance of the classical era. And let me play just the beginning for you so you hear what you're going to know what you're going to expect. This is music that is very harmonious. It meets the definition of sinfonia, or instruments playing together in a harmonious way. It's a very beautiful piece. What she does is she uses space and silence in a way that those classical composers don't. And a few techniques that you'll see from the stage where the strings are playing, but you're not hearing sound. You're hearing brush. Those are the techniques and sounds that she adds back to our sinfonia. So, that was a very quick history lesson. We took you through Renaissance to Baroque to classical, a little bit of Romantic, and then up to the 20th century. I'm going to end it there, and I'll just ask if anybody has any questions that you want to ask, either about what we talked about today or anything about the symphony and the symphony season. We have just a few minutes left. Any questions? We covered it all. You're ready for your test and your exam. Loretta. Traditional symphony fan who went and had that experience of being emotionally moved by something, even if they didn't have a history with it or a deeper understanding of the piece. And that is really special, because that's what we're aiming for, of course, with the performances of the symphony. And that's really what music is. Last week in Topeka, I gave the United States premiere, just the second performance of a piece by Tusheng Wen. We played one of his pieces last year. He's a Chinese composer who I met in Thailand and then again in China when I went for the Contemporary Music Festival. You would not have liked it, probably. But some people might have. Some people did. Some people really did. And I was a little nervous about it because it was definitely the furthest out piece that I've played. And in this case, when I programmed the piece, it was not done. He was writing it, so it's not like I got to look at it and decide, oh yeah, my audience is going to really like this. It was being worked on. It happened to be a companion piece to Dvorak's New World Symphony, which we were also playing on the concert. So there was a logic to playing this piece of music. And I remember I talked to my assistant conductor up in Topeka, and I said, kind of nervously, well, is the audience going to like it? And he said, it sounds organized. It's not haphazard, because that's one of the things that I think is very difficult for us to take in. If the sounds just sound haphazard and random, then you don't feel like you're listening to a composition. It feels like you're listening to noise. And in this case, the music moved in shapes and waves. It wasn't the same way we think of what you just heard, that were very beautiful as well. But it was interesting to me because all of these examples, from Monteverdi to Bach to Mozart to Beethoven, sound, and it's planned sound, and the effect that you have as a listener is based on what the composer has set up for you. And if I would go a step further, I think one of the things that makes music enjoyable to all of us is that a composer will set up expectations, and then you'll either delay the result of that expectation or you meet that expectation. And then once you meet that expectation, then we feel a sense of pleasure with that. We enjoy what that feels like. And so all of the structures, all of the different ensembles, all of the different size of orchestras, all of the different forms, whether it's concerto or symphony or something else, are designed to create that organization of sound that creates expectations that then are resolved in some way. Sometimes people will say to me, I don't like dissonance. And I will say to you, yes, you do. You just don't quite understand it, in the sense that Bach is full of dissonance. Bach is full, he may have the most dissonance, but he then resolves that dissonance very quickly and very easily. So he puts you in the air and then he brings you back to the ground. And then later on, we get to someone like Wagner. Well, he'll create a dissonance and he'll suspend you in the air, and you think, he's going to put me back down, and then he takes you to another step of dissonance that suspends you in the air, and then another step, and then another step, and then eventually he'll bring you back to the ground. In the case of the Ring operas, 17 hours later, he brings you back to the ground in a really significant way. But it's that set of expectations and resolution that really, and without the dissonance, you wouldn't have that return. You would just have something that's very static and actually quite boring. So, I don't remember how we even got there, but does anybody else have another question? Yes? Oh, yeah. Yes. Absolutely. First one at Hammond's Hall. Yes, yeah, absolutely. Hallie or Caitlin would be very interested in that. Saturday night at the pre-concert talk, I will talk more in depth about the four pieces that we're going to play. So I'll talk about Bach and the Brandenburg Concertos, how they came to be. I'll talk about Schubert, a little bit more about his life. He's fascinating, some really interesting stories. Mozart, of course, is a wonderfully fascinating composer, and then tell you a little bit about Caroline Shaw as well. So it'll be more specific to the pieces that you're going to hear. And I'll on the stage during the concert on this one. Oh yeah, that's true. You can. This talk is on Facebook, and you can watch it at any time. Yeah, so you can watch the replay of the talk as well. Yeah, that's right. Thank you. And YouTube. Great. Okay, so it'll be Facebook and YouTube. Terrific. Yeah. Any other questions, comments? Yes. 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 So the question, so that everybody can hear, is She heard that Beethoven dedicated the Eroica Symphony to Napoleon. You will hear this next year when we do the Eroica concert too, but it's a while. So, and that he became disillusioned with Napoleon. And the question is, did he just take his name off, or did he dedicate it to someone else? And that is one of the great stories in music history. No, I'll tell you right now, and then we'll forget by the time we come back around. Beethoven was enamored with Napoleon specifically because Beethoven was an anti-monarchist. He did not like the monarchy and nobility, and he was known, he was a genius and beloved in Vienna. But when he would bump into, when someone of high status would be walking down the street, Beethoven would not get out of the way. He would just knock into them and move on. He did not bow to royalty. And so, for someone who was not as important as Beethoven was, that would probably get you thrown in jail. With Beethoven, it was, he's just a grumpy genius. He's just a crank and a grumpy genius. So he liked Napoleon because Napoleon was the promised liberty, fraternity, equality. I mean, the idea of no longer would we have monarchs, now we would be governed by the people. But Napoleon, as we know, in himself, emperor. And so Beethoven had written this piece, the Eroica Symphony, which means heroic symphony. He had written it for Napoleon, but it was not completed and published. And then when he heard that Napoleon had crowned himself emperor, he took his pen and he crossed out Napoleon's name to the point that he tore a hole in the score, and then rededicated it to the memory of a great hero, or the Eroica, the heroic symphony. So it is his memory of what the promise of Napoleon was that then becomes the subject of the symphony, and Napoleon is removed from the dedication. So there's your answer to that great question. Take that, Napoleon. That's right. All right, well, I'm going to end it right now. Thank you for coming. Thank you for coming all year long. Jim, thank you for hosting here at First and Calvary. We'll look forward to another good season of Behind the Baton talks next year. And watch closely in the next couple weeks. We will be revealing what next season's theme is and the pieces that we're going to be performing. It's going to be a great year next year. I am just thrilled with what we're going to be playing. So thank you so much. Thank you all for coming, and we'll see you on Saturday night.